Well, welcome everyone to our next session at our virtual FA 101. This session, we are going to focus on the Student Aid Index and the calculation that is associated with it. So we're really happy that you're here. This is going to be a little bit of an in the weeds session. So we think it's important though. We think that when people know how the FAFSA works or what the formula looks like and what it takes into account, and importantly, what it doesn't take into account, that just makes us all feel a little bit more confident about the questions we get from students and parents and how to answer them. So that's the goal for today, is to have you walk away feeling like, okay, I know what counts and what doesn't count when we look at that SAI formula. So the SAI replaced the expected family contribution. So that went into effect last year. So the EFC is gone. We now have our SAI, but the formula is updated as well. So it's not just a name change. The methodology and the formula behind the Student Aid Index was also updated. But I will say that the Student Aid Index is used very similarly to how the EFC was. So there wasn't really a change in how it was used, but there have been some tweaks to the formula itself. So even if you were familiar with how the formula worked in the past, a few of the things I will highlight today are some of the differences with the new SAI formula versus the old EFC formula. So the SAI is determined using the information on the FAFSA. The information on the FAFSA is what we're going to walk through, and so you can see how it's directly connected to calculating the SAI. There is a parent contribution and a student contribution behind the scenes, and those get combined. So even though we're using an index, not technically a contribution anymore, behind the scenes, there really is a piece that comes from the parent's information, a piece that comes from the student information, and then those are combined into the official SAI. A student's need is calculated the same way, at least to start with, at all schools. And it's a really basic formula. Basically, what every school does is they say, okay, what does it cost to attend here? That might be 15,000, it might be 70,000. So the cost of attendance is established. Subtracted from that is the student aid index, which theoretically, at least in the beginning, is the same at every school. And then what happens is you take that SAI, you subtract it from the cost, and that's how much need a student has. So a student's level of need, as you can see here, is going to vary depending on the school that they're attending. So here we have a cost of attendance at a low-cost school, so let's just say it's $12,600 per year, a mid-cost school of 27,500, and then a higher cost school that's like $70,000 per year. That SAI stays the same, so the level of need or the amount of need that a student has is going to vary by school. Every school is going to do their best to fill 100% of that need. Now, you working with students and seeing lots of financial aid offers through the years, you know that not every school is able to fill 100% of need. But what we're hoping is that students are able to find those schools that can meet a significant amount of need and actually make higher education affordable. So the SAI has to be used to determine eligibility for the following programs. So the SAI is how you determine eligibility for a Pell Grant, unless the student is eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But otherwise, the student's Pell Grant eligibility is directly connected to the SAI. So how it actually works, and this was a change from last this was a change as of last year. The way it's determined how much Pell Grant a student is eligible for based on their SAI is you take the maximum amount of Pell, which this year is $7,395. I had a brain cramp there for a moment. And you subtract the SAI. So let's say $7,395 is the maximum Pell. The student has an SAI of $3,000. Their Pell Grant eligibility is going to be $4,395. So they simplified that piece of it so that when you know a student's SAI, you know not only whether they're eligible for a Pell Grant, but how much Pell Grant they're eligible to receive. There used to be this awful chart, but now it's literally just max Pell minus SAI. That tells you how much Pell Grant eligibility a student has. So the Pell Grant, the SAI also has to be used to determine eligibility for subsidized loans. So a school makes a decision as to whether a student's eligible for subsidized, unsub, or combination of the two, and they use the SAI and their cost of attendance in order to do that. There's something called campus-based programs. We don't talk a lot about this because to the student, it doesn't really matter how the funding comes from the federal government. But basically, the federal government provides lump sum grants to schools. So schools, many schools, not all, get a bucket of supplemental educational opportunity grant funds that they then award to students. Schools get a lump sum of work study, and schools have some flexibility as to how they award these particular funds. But the SAI is a critical piece of what schools need to use when determining who gets those funds. So they have a little more flexibility than like with Pell, where they don't have any flexibility. They have the ability to, prioritize certain students, but they still have to do it within the rules and regulations, which are directly tied to what the student's SAI was. So many schools also use the SAI to determine eligibility for their own need-based institutional aid. So here in Maine, for example, every school except for Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby uses the SAI information to determine eligibility for their institutional, their university or college grants. Those other schools, Bates, Bowdoin, and Colby, and other schools that use the CSS profile, even when they have that supplemental form, they can only use it to determine their eligibility, students' eligibility for institutional money. They still have to use the FAFSA SAI for Pell Grant, federal student loans, supplemental grant, and work study. So there are actually three SAI formulas. There's Formula A, which is used for dependent students. There's Formula B that's used for independent students who don't have dependents other than a spouse, so that basically they have no children of their own, for example. And Formula C for independent students who do have dependents, so do have children. Formula A and C are actually really similar to each other. Formula B is quite different, to be honest with you. Today, we're going to focus on Formula A. So we're going to focus on the formula for dependent students, but the concepts are pretty similar for independent students. And I do want you to know that if you go to our famemaine.com/FA101 page, where I showed you that at the opening if you were with us, we have all of the session descriptions and we have resources. And in the resource for this particular session, we have the overarching guide for the SAI, and it includes all of the formulas and all of the worksheets for all of the formulas. So even though we're going to focus on this one formula in this session, if you want to do the hand calculations for independent students, that information is available on our website. One thing that's really critical with the formula, and this is one of those things that we really try to spread the word on, and we'd love to have you help with that and share this information with students and families, is that assets often have very little, if any, impact on financial aid eligibility. And part of the reason why assets have so little impact is many people don't have to provide asset information. Many people won't even see that assets are requested when filling out the FAFSA. And so built into this SAI formula are the criteria in which the assets can be excluded. So assets can be excluded when a student qualifies for a maximum Pell Grant. So I mentioned maximum Pell Grants a moment ago. And what I want you to know about maximum Pell Grants is they are new as of last year. And what they basically mean is just that the student's eligible for that maximum amount in this current year of $7,395. But what's key about this is that you can tell whether or not a student is eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell Grant before they ever file the FAFSA. And that is because it's tied to poverty tables. So one of the things I appreciate that Michelle has done for us is she has gone in and updated those tables for us. So if you go to the educators page, you will see the information where you can look this up. So for example, if there's a family that's the couple's married, dependent student, couple's married, family of four, let's just say that they have an AGI of less than $54,600, they are eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. And they well, you can identify that ahead of time. Now, they still have to go through the process of filing the FAFSA, but hopefully that will encourage families to know, okay, yes, it does look like I'm eligible for a maximum or a minimum Pell, so of course I'm going to go ahead and fill out the FAFSA. We know it's still an issue sometimes that people just don't realize how much money is available to help them pay for higher education. So this early awareness piece is critical. Just as another example, imagine that same family of four, except that in this case, it's a single parent with three kiddos. They can have an AGI, that family can have an AGI of 70,200 or less. If it's less than that, they're going to be eligible for a maximum Pell Grant. So think about what a difference maker that is, and for families to know about that ahead of time. So again, additional information on our website. But anyone who meets that criteria of being eligible for a maximum Pell Grant are going to find that assets are excluded. They will not even see any asset questions on the FAFSA. Some additional situations in which assets are excluded if the applicant's parents, and this is a case of dependent students, but there's also something similar on the independent student side. If the AGI is less than 60,000 and they didn't have to file certain schedules, or they had to file a Schedule C, but they meet certain criteria, then they also are not going to be required to provide any assets on the FAFSA. Okay, so we have a lot of families here in Maine who earn less than 60,000 and don't file any schedules. And all of those individuals will be not required to provide any asset information. And then last but not least, any applicants who are receiving any means tested benefits are not going to be required to provide any assets. So that's going to be looking at families who had any family member who received a means tested benefit in 23 or 24, they do not have to provide any asset information. So those are going to be things like SNAP, TANF, WIC, subsidized housing, main care. So that's a really big one. So if anyone in that household receives main care, for example, they will check yes to that box and they won't have to provide any asset information at all. So yes, we want people to be saving. We want people to know that assets have very little impact, and especially for many families, they won't even have to provide asset information. And Michelle, did we have any questions that we need to address? So please, first of all, ask your questions. You can put them in the chat. Heck, we're a small enough group that if you want to unmute yourself and call it out and ask your question, we're totally good with that, or you can raise your hand. But Michelle, I just wanted to check before I continue if there's anything that we need to address.
Yeah, thanks for that. Right now there are not. Sarah and I were just popping some resources in the chat there for you.
Okay, fabulous. I didn't look in the chat clearly, so thank you for that.
No.
Okay. So let's look at an actual scenario. And so in this scenario, we're going to pretend that we have a family of four. Parents are, 46, both of them. Their oldest child, Max, is going to be the one headed off to college. He's 17 and a senior in high school, and he has a younger brother, Chris, who is 13. Mom and dad, we're going to keep this really basic. Mom and dad's financial information is that they earn collectively about $95,000 per year. That's their adjusted gross income. They don't have any other sources of income. It's only the income from their work. They pay $9,520 in taxes. And for this first scenario, they don't have any assets at all. Max, the student, will obviously have to fill out his section of the FAFSA. He did file taxes and he earned $8,000. He doesn't have any other sources of income, and he doesn't pay any federal taxes, and he himself does not have any assets. Okay. So what happens is when we are going to be walking through the scenario in just a moment, we're going to use the information that I just highlighted. But in your packet, and this is on the website, so it's a little in person, we were able to actually hand out packets, but I'm going to show you the packet in just a moment. But you can see it on our website and print it off if you would like to. We will use information that will come from other pages of the packet. So for example, there are tables on what we allow for the payroll tax. There's an income protection allowance. There's an asset protection allowance. There's this weird calculation that gets used at the end of determining the parent SAI. So those are all tables that I'm going to be referring to as we walk through this calculation. So what I'm going to do at the moment is I am going to stop sharing and I am going to switch over to our resource. And I have it open, so let me just get there. Whoops, that's not what I want. That's what I want right there. Okay, Michelle, you are seeing that, correct? Did it switch over? Okay.
Sorry. Yes, it just came up.
Okay, super. Okay, so what we're going to do for the next couple of minutes is we're actually going to walk through a scenario. So you can see up here the scenario that I just outlined. Family of four, this is their income, taxes paid, and for the moment, let's assume that they have no assets. So what I'm going to do really quickly, because again, we're not in person and I can't just hand you the packet of information, I'm just going to show you very quickly what is in that packet again that's on our website and you can print off. So we have the formula. We're going to do the parent contribution from income first. That's a 2-page section. Then we'll do the student contribution from income. We're going to walk through these line by line, and so that's 2 pages. But these are the tables that I was referring to. So I'm going to explain when these tables come into play, but that's a table that we're going to use to determine the payroll tax, 2 pages. Here are a couple of other tables that I'm going to be referencing, and then the last ones that I'm going to be referencing. Okay, so those are all in that packet on the website. So let's actually walk through how this all works. Note here. Okay. So we're going to start on the parent side of things, and we're going to keep this really, really simple. So the scenario here is probably the most basic scenario you could get, or one of the more basic scenarios. But the reality is that even the most complicated situation is much more straightforward now than it used to be in the past. But what I'm going to first do is I'm going to figure out all of the sources of that family's income. So this family has that adjusted gross income of $95,000. In this case, the family does not have any tax exempt income. They don't have any untaxed portions of an IRA distribution. They don't have any untaxed portions of a pension that was distributed, and they don't have any foreign income exclusions. If families did have these sources of income, they would have to, they would be factored into the SAI. But what you're going to notice that is no longer factored into the SAI is untaxed income. So that's a really significant change from in the past. In the past, if parents, for example, contributed to a retirement plan and they did that pre-tax, that income would have been recognized in the formula, but now it no longer is. They've really tried to simplify things and take virtually all the information they can directly from the tax return. So untaxed income no longer comes into play. Okay, so this family might be putting, $15,000 a year pre-tax into a retirement plan, and it's not going to factor into financial aid eligibility with this current formula. Okay. So the parent income, we've totaled that all up. Now there are some offsets against income, and you're going to see those on both the parent side and the student side. So an example where a parent might have an offset is, let's just say that the parent, their student has been in college for a couple of years. They're able to take advantage of an education tax credit. That basically reduces their tax burden. That's a good thing. But here we can take into account that they did have a tax credit, because this is going to sound a little bit weird, but when the parents' taxes are decreased, that makes it look like there's more income available. So if their taxes were decreased because they had a tax credit that was from education expenses, we want to add that back in, okay? Because we don't want the fact that they had an education tax credit to count against them. I'm going to explain offsets a bit more when it comes to the student, and I think that will be a lot more clear what I'm talking about than with this example with education tax credits. But it's basically a way to recognize the fact that the parents got a tax credit, but we don't want it to count against them in terms of eligibility for the next year. So we're going to total up all of the offsets. We don't have any in this case. And the next category we're going to check on are the allowances. This is really critical for so many reasons. So this basically says, okay, this family is earning X number of dollars per year, but all of that money is not available to go towards higher education. So we need to take into account that there are expenses and sources or pieces of that income that are not available to the family. So let's walk through those. So the first one is the taxes paid. So obviously, if a family earns 95,000 and they pay 9,500 or a little bit more in taxes, that money's not available to them to pay for higher ed. I referenced a moment ago the payroll tax. We're all familiar with the fact that right off the top, we have Social Security taxes taken out of us and Medicare taxes taken out of us. And so on the Medicare side, that is 1.45%. So basically, if we look at our paychecks, 1.45% of our pay comes out and goes to the federal government to pay for Medicare. Additionally, the old age survivors disability insurance, that tax rate is 6.25%. So that is also taken out of our income right off the top. We don't see that money. So what I have done here is I've taken 95,000, I've multiplied it times 1.45. And if you look at that payroll tax table in the back a little bit, this is where I came up with that 1.45%. I'm going to take the 95,000 times the 6.2%. To calculate that amount. So right off the top, we know that this 95,000, not only did they pay federal income tax, but they paid payroll taxes. So that money is not available. The formula takes that into account. The next allowance is the income protection allowance. So the formula does recognize that it costs money to run a household. So in the case of a family of four, the the income protection allowance is $43,870. Okay. I'm going to just for a moment really quickly go over to that table because I do want to show you something. So the family size dictates the amount of the income protection allowance. So for that family of four, that income protection allowance is $43,870. Sometimes families will say, why did my SAI go up? And sometimes it's as simple as a family member may no longer be part of the family. Maybe there was an older kiddo that last year was in the household that is no longer in the household. Look what happens when we go from a family of four to a family of three. That income protection allowance drops dramatically. So those are the things that when we're working with families and we hear them say, well, my SAI went up or my SAI went down, one of the things that we're going to look at is did the family size change from one year to the next? Because that has a pretty significant impact on eligibility. So now let me go back to where we were. So we are at our allowances. So we've already talked about income tax, payroll taxes, the income protection allowance, and then there is an employment allowance because the formula recognizes, or the people who put the formula together recognize that when we work, it costs us money. So whether it be gas money or clothes or lunches or whatever might be the case. So there is an employment allowance, and it is the lesser of 35% of the parent's combined income or $4,890. So in this case, the $890 is the allowance that we're going to use. Okay, so these are all of our allowances against income. So we're going to take those, we're going to add those up and carry those over to the next page. So the parent's allowances against income, $65,540. So this is the formula saying, hey, that money is not available to pay for higher education. That's going towards other things. So we take the parent income, we subtract out the allowances, and then we have what's called the parent available income. Now, this is not the SAI, okay, just to be really clear. This is a transitory, I'm having trouble with that word, calculation, okay? Number for our calculation. So then what we would do is calculate assets. We're not going to do that right now because Michelle's going to touch on that in a moment. But in this scenario, let's first assume that the family has no assets at all. So then the last piece is we want to figure out what the parent contribution is, or the parent portion of the SAI. So we're going to take that parent available income, parent contribution from assets, which in this case is zero. So then we have the parent adjusted available income. Bear with me while we go to the table that we put this number through. This is the part of the formula which, when we say, oh, how does income translate into an SAI? This is why we cannot easily translate it for you, is because what you basically do is you come to this table and you look and you say, okay, the parent's adjusted available income is $29,440. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to say, okay, I fall in this bucket, 29,440. So I'm going to take the SAI and I'm going to take $6,036 plus 29% of the adjusted available income over 26,700. I know I might as well be speaking a foreign language, okay? But what we want to focus back on is the fact that what that means is that when we put this number through the formula, we have that 6,036 plus the 29% of the amount over. That means we're going to take that, we're going to add those two numbers together. That's how we come up with 6,834. That is the parent SAI. That is the parent portion of an SAI for a family that is earning $95,000 with no assets, and they're a family of 4, married parents, 2 kiddos. Okay? So that's how we got there. That's all that impacts the parent SAI. Okay? Now let's talk about the student contribution from income. So for the students, we are going to say this student had an adjusted gross income of $8,000. They did indeed file taxes. One thing that we mentioned briefly in the CSS profile section is that with the new changes to the FAFSA, if a student doesn't file taxes, they do not provide any income information on the FAFSA anymore. So just like I mentioned a moment ago that untaxed income on the parent side, like a contribution to a retirement plan, does not factor into the formula anymore, students who have earnings but don't file taxes, that does not show up on the FAFSA anymore. Okay? I'm going to go through this scenario, and you're going to see, though, that even students who do have earnings and file taxes, income is really not the driver of the student aid index, the student portion of it. But I just want to make that clear that students who don't file taxes don't have to put in any income information. But this student did. So they filed taxes. They had $8,000 in earning. I wanted to talk here. I said I would mention more about the offsets. An easier way to understand the offsets is when it comes to work study. So let's just say, I didn't use it in this scenario, but let's just say that a student earned, $10,000 in a year. And 7,000 of that they earned working in a regular job somewhere, a local business. But $3,000 of their earnings came from work study. Well, we don't want work study to count against a student when they apply for aid the next year. So in that scenario, the students would have to pay taxes or be at least looked at to pay taxes on that full $10,000. But here they could list $3,000 of those earnings were from work study. And then guess what? We would be reducing the amount of income that we were looking at. So we would not be using the $10,000 that the student earned. We'd only be using the $7,000 that was earned in non-work study related work. Okay? So that's how that offset works. If a student has enough scholarships and grants that they have to pay taxes on some of those scholarships and grants, those would be listed here so that they would come out and they would not negatively impact financial aid eligibility going forward. Okay? But our student here, he didn't do any of that. He just worked a regular job. So his earnings are $8,000. He didn't pay any income taxes. He does still have to pay payroll taxes. So again, use the same 1.45% times 8,000 to get 116. The 6.2%, again, listed in that table, multiply that times 8,000 to get our $496. Now, students also have an income protection allowance, and the student's income protection allowance is hard-coded in. So the student's income protection allowance is determined each year, tends to go up a little bit each year, and it's used for all dependent students have that same dollar amount, okay? So for the current FAFSA, it's $11,510. So we're going to add up all of the allowances against student income. So taxes, which none in this case, payroll taxes, and the income protection allowance. So the student's allowances against income are $12,122. So what's that going to mean? If we come down to the next page, we're going to say this is what their allowances are. And if we subtract that from their $8,000 income, we actually have a negative number. We're going to take that number, we're going to do a conversion, or we're going to do an assessment, 50% of it being available. We still have a negative number. And so we're going to set that to 0 though, based on the instructions. So let me just back up and do a takeaway from that particular section. Because of the income allowance protection for students, students typically do not have any contribution from income. There's no impact on the SAI for income until students earn like over $12,000. So every now and then we'll run into students who will say, well, I don't want to work too much because maybe it will negatively impact my financial aid eligibility. Because of that income protection allowance, students will not see any impact at all on their SAI until they earn over $12,000 or so. So students can be working and know that that is not going to negatively impact their income. And even if it's over, even if they earn over 12,000, it's a very small percentage, okay? So one of the takeaways about this formula is that income on the parent side is a significant driver of the SAI. Assets, not so much. We'll talk about that in a moment. Income is really not a driver, especially for dependent students on the student side, but assets do have more of an impact. Okay, so then what we're going to do, so we've set our SAI, our calculation at the meantime, we've set this to 0. The student has no assets, okay? So then we're going to get our final SAI. We're going to pull over the 6,834 SAI, that's the parent SAI from the first 2 pages of the worksheet. The student has no contribution from income. The student has no contribution from assets. And so what we have is we have a total SAI of 6,834. Okay, so that is what the SAI would be in that scenario. Any questions about anything that we went through? Did we have anything that came in, Michelle?
Nope, there is not anything. Oh, so there is actually 2 questions. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's good.
One's from Elizabeth. Is the student income taxes prior year to?
Yes, it is. So prior year being that easiest way to think about it is did an FA night last night. And believe it or not, was talking about the 26-27 FAFSA. So this was a presentation for high school juniors. So they're going to be filing the 26-27 FAFSA. When you're trying to figure out which year of income is applicable in this formula, we call it prior year, but what you want to do is you want to look at the year of the FAFSA, so 26-27 in the case I'm mentioning, and you want to go 2 years back from that first number is going to be the applicable tax year. So for the 26-27 FAFSA, it's 24 income that comes into play, both on the student side and on the parent side. So it indeed is a snapshot in time.
So Mila, the reason I'm asking is I can picture a lot of, say, juniors in high school or sophomores and juniors in high schools who aren't necessarily working, so they're not filing. So conceivably, a lot of these students might not have filed at all
Right.
prior year, so they would be 0.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, theirs is going to be 0 from income because they're not even going to have to provide what their income was, because if they didn't file taxes, there is nowhere on the FAFSA anymore that they're required to provide their income information. So yes, you are correct. So that side of the formula is really simple for a lot of high school seniors because, as you mentioned, maybe they didn't work at all, or they worked some but not enough to have to file taxes. So that's going to be a 0 SAI calculation from income for those students. Okay.
Great, and we have one more from Gail, and we will talk about this a little bit more when we talk about the assets, but I was wondering if you had anything you wanted to add to this as well. She asked, how does student savings impact it?
Much more significantly. So we're going to run through those scenarios. Actually, Michelle, are you okay with this? While
Yes.
we've got this up, maybe I'm going to do that right now. Does that sound okay? We did this last week and we did it a little bit differently, but I think let's do this. Let's start with the student because that's actually easier, or it's more straightforward. Okay, so let's just keep our same student here. Okay, he earned 8,000 we work through the calculation. He has 0 contributions from income. But let's say this student has been really great at saving. And let's say that he has chosen to save by just putting his money in a savings account that's in his name. So it's clearly a student asset. Now, the reason that I mention that, again, going into the weeds a little bit here, but if the student's parents, for example, had a 529 plan, even though the student is the beneficiary on that plan, that's going to count as a parent asset. So when we look at assets, and we look at student assets specifically, there are some student assets that count on the student side, but things like 529 plans actually count on the parent side. And that's a good thing, and you're going to see why. Okay. So in this scenario, the student has $10,000 sitting in their savings account. So we're going to take their $10,000 here on the side. We're going to bring that down. They have a net worth of $10,000. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that, and this is the same on the parent side, that whether it's $10,000 in cash, whether it's $10,000 in equity, because maybe someone owns a camp and they have $10,000 in equity, whether it's $10,000 in business value, these assets are all treated the same way. So there's no distinction between a liquid asset and an asset that is not as liquid, like equity in a business. Okay. So, but for now, let's just say the student has this sitting in their savings account. And so then what's going to happen is we're going to total their net worth. It's $10,000. Then there's an asset conversion rate of 20%. So we're going to take our 10,000 times 20%, and that's going to be 2,000. What that does is that comes right down to the bottom line. So in this scenario here, where the parent contribution was 6,834, we still have no contribution from income, because again, up top, their allowances exceeded their income, actually to the negative, but we are instructed to make that a 0. But the student asset contribution from assets would be 2,000. So in this case, where the student has $10,000 sitting in their account, if assets are required to be provided, the SAI is going to jump from 6,834 to 8,834. So student assets absolutely do have an impact, which is why we want students to think strategically about how they save. Even in this case, I'd still rather have the $10,000, but keep in mind, if they choose to save in different ways, maybe then it will count as a parent asset and will have less impact. And here is why. So let me go to the parent side of the formula. Okay. So here we have parents, and we went through the scenario. We've gotten to the point that this parent has, these parents have 6,834 SAI. Okay. But in scenario B, the family has saved $50,000. And again, we're just going to say it's $50,000 sitting in a savings account, but it could be $50,000 of some other asset that's required on the FAFSA. So we take the $50,000 and we bring it down here. And we multiply it times 0.12. But it does not mean, this is confusing, and when I first was doing this formula, I'm like, oh, I thought parent assets counted even less. So we're going to take the 50,000, we're going to multiply it by 12%, which is going to give us 6,000, but we're not done yet, okay? So hold tight, we're not done yet. It's not a $6,000 addition to the bottom line like it was an addition to the bottom line for the student. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take that available income and we're going to add it to that. So then that parent adjusted available income becomes 35,000. Now, again, going into the weeds a little bit here, so just bear with me. Then when we come over to this table here, this is where we're going to recalculate what the SAI is. Okay? So again, it's not a straight addition to the bottom line, but instead it's an increase to the adjusted available income that then gets put through this wacky formula. So just to jump forward for a moment, what that becomes is that wacky formula with the higher amount of adjusted available income translates to an SAI of 8,743. Okay. So what happened was this family had $50,000 in savings, yet the SAI on the parent side increased by less than $2,000, only increased by $1,912. So again, the real takeaway here is that parent income, significant impact. Parent assets, much less significant impact. Student income, very little impact. Student assets, potentially much more impact. So kind of just keep that in mind as we're kind of going through these scenarios. That's kind of the big picture overview. All right, so now what I would like to do is go back to the presentation, and then I'm gonna do just a couple more quick things, and then I'm going to turn it back to, I'm gonna turn it over to Michelle. Okay. All right, so we reviewed this scenario. I hope you're all seeing back to the presentation. Michelle, is that the case? Are we all back on the presentation? Okay. So parent contributions from income. So let's just focus on the income a little bit. As we've spoken about, the parent income is a driving force behind the SAI. So a parent that has a $60,000 income, again, I'm just being really generalized. You know, there are other details that could impact the SAI, but just generally speaking, a parent with an income of 60,000, their SAI is going to be about 655. If we increase the income by 20%, so we're going to keep increasing the income in increments of 20,000. So we increase the income to 80,000, the SAI jumps up to 4190. So $20,000 more in income, increase the SAI by 3,500 basically. If we jump the income up another 20,000, the SAI becomes 7978. So this $20,000 increase in the AGI actually increases the SAI by $3,788. 120, we're going to go up incrementally another 20,000. Look what that does to the SAI. So the additional $20,000 in income at this point increases the SAI by almost $7,000. Another $20,000 in income is going to result in this sort of an SAI, meaning the SAI for the additional $20,000 in income actually increases by over $7,500. The takeaway from this piece is that think back to those allowances, right? So when we looked at those allowances, if the income is higher, then yes, the taxes paid are probably higher, the payroll tax is higher. What's not higher as an allowance when the family's income increases? The income protection allowance is no higher as families earn more money. Their employment allowance is no higher as families earn more money. But what's the reality we often experience? If families earn, 140,000 rather than 60,000, they're getting the same income protection allowance, but they probably are spending more money on their housing, right? The formula does not acknowledge that. The formula uses that set income protection allowance regardless of what the income is. So it doesn't go up as the income goes up. But what we know is that a family that has more income is probably spending more on their expenses. So the formula is simplified. It doesn't take that into account. So a much more significant piece of income is expected to be available to pay for higher education as the family income exceeds certain amounts. Okay, so as the family income goes up, more and more of that income is assumed available by the formula. Okay. So I do want to just briefly, I got to check on time here, where we at? I just want to briefly talk about the SAI and the EFC formula. So what we found is that that family that has $95,000 in income had an SAI of 6834. Some of the differences that we've already mentioned. One is that untaxed income no longer comes into play like it did with the EFC formula. The EFC formula used to take into account state taxes. The current SAI formula does not. The income protection allowances were adjusted to take into account that state taxes no longer were looked at. The income protection allowance did increase pretty dramatically when we went from the EFC to the SAI formula. This is a biggie, and I know people hate it. The family that had multiple kids in college when the formula was the EFC formula, that was divided by the number in college. That does not happen with the SAI formula. And then last year, there was this interesting thing that happened, which was a student could have a negative 1,500 SAI from income. And for a matter of fact, the student scenario that we just went through, we set that to 0 because we were told to, but last year they were able to have a negative 1,500 SAI, which reduced the parent SAI because it took the parent and subtracted out that negative for the student. So I'm mentioning this specifically because we have some students this year who their income and their family's income are virtually identical to last year, but their SAI is higher. And they're saying, why is my SAI higher? The information is almost exactly the same. And it's because the formula changed. And there no longer can be a negative contribution from students that lowers the overall SAI. That now is zeroed out, okay? So just to backtrack for a moment, the SAI for 24-25 in this exact same scenario would have been about 5,800, largely because of that negative SAI from the student side, a few other factors as well, but that's the primary one. But look at what happened if we went through the same thing, the same formula, using the old EFC formula in 23-24. The SAI was much higher. It was 9502. So the takeaway from this piece I want you to know is that the SAIs are lower, excuse me, on average than the EFCs were. So most families saw that as we transitioned to the new SAI formula, their SAIs went down, except for parents that had multiple kids in college. So now let's shift to assets. And I know we've already talked a little bit about it, but do you want to take it from here, Michelle?
I'd be happy to. I can just talk about this pretty quickly, seeing as Mila did a great job explaining the complexity of the calculation. But I want to make sure we also have time to talk about resources at the end too. So just quickly, when you're looking at the impact of assets on the SAI formula, obviously this is the basic information of the scenario we just went through, looking at the parent income being $95,000, student income being $8,000 with no assets. So let's shift this a little bit and then look at the scenario in which the parent has $50,000 of assets and the student has $10,000 of assets. Do you want to go to the next slide, Mila? From you?
Yes, I'm controlling those slides, aren't I? Thank you.
Hey, listen, it happens to the best of us. It's the nature of the game. So looking at this, you can see when you're considering the parent assets, the jump that incurs from $0 to 10,000 to 25 to 50 is not necessarily proportional. That's the thing that I like to point out about this piece in particular, just because of a couple of reasons. So obviously, when we were looking at that previous formula, we had the 12% asset conversion rate, but we also saw that in order to get the parent's contribution to the SAI, it fed through that wacky formula. So naturally, it's going to come out with, again, not exactly a proportional increase each time. But you can obviously see here how minimally it impacts the SAI, which is the major point that we want to get across, particularly on the parent side. We talked about the income being the major driver, not the assets in this portion of the formula. Another thing to take into account is when we were looking at the formula is that there's an asset protection allowance that does exist. In the past couple of years, it has been 0, just straight across. So that's not something that's been taken into account. It may come back. Really, I guess who's to say exactly what the future holds, but that's something that is worked into the formula itself. So that might come about in the future. But again, currently it does sit at 0. So that does feed into the formula. So looking at the students portion, you can see that this is a little bit more of like a ratioed increase. Again, that's because it doesn't factor into that wacky formula there. And it is a little bit more cut and dry when you're looking at it, and obviously larger increase in the SAI. So when we were looking at the $10,000 jump from parents' SAI contributions, and then you're looking at just a $3,000 jump on the student side, the students increases by $600, parent increases by $348. So it's like, it's not proportional. It's a pretty dramatic increase on the student's end versus the parent's end. So again, just to reiterate what Mila was saying, that's why saving strategies are so important, particularly using those tools like the 529s to make sure that that ends up on the parent side and positively impacts the student in a way that, we want to see, really encouraging that saving mechanism. That's obviously a common myth that we hear a lot of the time. I don't really have much else to add on this slide.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
Michelle, I just skipped that other slide because I think we had reiterated all of that. So it's in the
Yeah.
PowerPoint if people want it, but I'll let you jump to this now. How about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I want to make sure we use this last minute to make sure you know about the resources that we have on our educators page. So this is our whole FAFSA resource bucket that again is on this page that exists just for you guys. So we have a number of different tools. Mila mentioned, a lot of the tables earlier on, but we also have things like the FAFSA prototype that's available on this page, which is super useful. And particularly to this presentation that we're talking about, the Federal Student Aid Estimator. Really great tool. So it does some of that calculation for you, gives you an estimate, again, just an estimate, but it gives you a good place to start in helping encourage students. Similar with the Pell Grant lookup tables that we went and put together there for you. So any questions, guys? Hearing none. I'm just gonna stop the recording now. If I can, there we go.